The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Foundation podcast with Alasdair Macleod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alasdair Macleod on behalf of the Gold Money Foundation, and I'm at the Hard Asset Show in New York, and with me I have Danielle Park of Juggling Dynamite, and she spoke here today. She did a newsletter editor presentation after the debt rush, understanding demand in a post-spending bubble world. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you.
The post-spending bubble world. So we're sort of post the spending bit. How do you see the bubble world at the moment, or the decline, the popping of the bubble? And what bubble are we really talking about?
Well, it's been the debt belief structure that we saw in the consumer markets build up until about 2006, in various housing markets in the world, and then extension of that by intervention by central bankers and governments when the bubble finally burst to try and keep the thing inflated. And what we've seen in the last few years is that all that government liquidity injection has pooled into pretty much every asset type. So you've had it go into bonds, you've had it go into commodities, precious metals, equities of all kinds, globally, everywhere. So I think now you are seeing that the ability to sustain that the asset prices has not been consistent or durable. We've had a bunch of different ramp-ups in the last couple of years, and we're now seemingly in a deflation phase again where the money is pooling in cash, the interjections from central bankers pooling in cash all over the world on balance sheets of banks and companies, not moving through the economy, not getting invested in real businesses, not creating jobs. And I think that that's the next phase of this, it seems to me, is where all the governments that tried all those approaches are being tossed out week over week, right? We're having regime changes in most countries in the world, and some of them, in some cases, every couple of months. It's just a crazy period. But I think the reason is that the old tools haven't worked, won't work, and there's much less appetite and tolerance for that going forward.
Right. Well, that gives me an awful lot to pick up on. It's difficult to know quite where to start. You mentioned that the central banks are worried about debt deflation, or rather you said it was debt deflation. I know, we all both know that the central banks, that is their worst nightmare, because they've all read Irving Fisher, and that's their sort of primary school, if there is such a thing in central banking circles. That's the one thing they do know. They're very, very worried about that, and so they're producing money. Another theme that you touched on is the bifurcation of the economy into the real economy and capital markets. And you didn't quite put it like that, but I think that's what you meant. Now, this is interesting because they're producing all this money and none of it is going into the economy. It's all going into speculative capital markets. Is that how you see it? Have I picked it up correctly?
Yes, because basically, if capitalism is the dominant theme that we're supposed to be following in, for example, the developed world, in the Western world, what traditionally asset markets were meant to be was a support, just like the banking sector was designed as a support to growth in the real economy. What happened in the last few years is that it became an extractive culture where it was no longer in support of real growth. It was about itself. It was about profitability in the finance sector. So you have a bunch of politicians that have deep linkages to the financial sector. You have lobbying at extreme levels from that sector. You had such a concentration of wealth there that they have really now dominated the democratic process. And so what we are is paying for that in the real economy, because it was no longer about how to build value. It was about how to extract as much for a few people.
Right. Can I stop you there? Because this is, I think, is one of my, sort of bête noirs. And that is the idea that the financial sector serves people. Now, what you're saying is that actually it is now serving itself, not people. So in pure economic terms, instead of working together to provide something that the community, if you like, in society wants, they're now in antagonism with society. Have I got you right on this?
Yes, and it's a historical pattern we've seen. This is not the first time we've seen this dynamic. We've had it through the centuries. That's why, Shakespeare talks about the pounds of flesh and the bankers, and you had it in the Roman times. It's very typical that, because here's the thing, leverage is just taking regular growth and magnifying it by adding some debt. Okay, it's a very basic construct. Every 20 years or so, we have a finance sector that discovers a new way to lever, a new way to add that magical potion of zeros to make moderate growth look bigger. And when that happens, you get an inflation trade that goes on for typically about 20 years. During that period, the people that are the aiders and abettors of that system, of the inflationary trade, make huge money, get huge accolades, rise to positions of power and influence, both in a social scale, in a political scale, and they become revered as the business leaders. They do it to an excess, always, though. And at some point, if I'm running a small business and I need a loan, I go to my banker and I say, here's my business model. Can you give me some financing to get started? In its origin, that is a perfect symbiotic relationship. The banker is there to provide the capital in rational metrics, not to every crazy person who asks, but to someone who has a decent business model, has discipline and leadership skills that can make a business work.
There's a common interest between the bank and the customer, and as the customer grows, the business from that customer grows as far as the bank is concerned.
Exactly.
It's a relationship.
And there's subjective assessments that go into that sometimes, or traditionally with respect to character. For example, the idea that credit is trust, is the origin of the word, trust. I trust you, that if I give you this money, you will fulfill the promises, right, which is to pay the interest, but also to pay it back at the end. And so that's a very healthy, let's say, model of how business is supported by banking. What you got to a period, though, was where the models were being driven primarily by not supporting, but by how can I magnify and make a quick buck, and I don't care, I'll give you money because I don't care, I'm not on the hook, I don't care if you really pay me back, I'm going to sell this debt to somebody else next week. And so around it goes. So during that period, we did so many erroneous things. We did so many reckless things. The captains of it, the leaders of it, were revered as wise when in fact they were fools. And now they've driven it into the ditch. So now we're into the realization of that. But the problem is the status quo is so entrenched. It's very difficult. We were speaking earlier about modern portfolio theory as an example. That is just one of the symptoms of this. So during the 80s and 90s, when conditions were easy, inflation was falling, tax rates were falling, interest rates were falling, everybody looked like a wizard because it's the best of all possible worlds. And then you throw on that the demographic of the boomers coming in and how many trends they were driving. So everybody looked like really brilliant. And you had a financial community on the intellectual side even, who were writing papers that were commissioned by the sales arm. So the sales arm was the leverage adders, who were making these fabulous profits and bets. And it was all going well for a time. And so the PhDs were basically, bought to say that this was all healthy, organic, the way it should work, and supportive of the economy. So everyone, eventually over that cycle, everyone stops thinking. They stop doing critical objective assessment. They start jumping on the party wagon, and the system blows up. So I say today, I get a kick out of people saying today that they have to pump more money into the banking system or the economy will blow up. My point would be the economy already blew up. It blew up a few years ago, as it often does when you get into these excessive leverage phases. So it's already blown up. What they've tried to do is extend and pretend to keep that little game going. And I think the interesting part is now, because they've tried that for the last, let's say, 3 years, really from 2009, all the interventions, all the reflations, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't created jobs.
Because the money's not going into the economy.
That's it.
It's just going around this capital system.
That's it.
Which is populated by, people who want some protection from this financial whirlwind and all they're finding is a system that seeks to profit directly, in antagonism, as it were, from people.
Right.
So, but I thought regulation was meant to. I thought good financial regulation was meant to stop this.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does in a way. Key broad strokes are important, I think, in a civilized society. I'm not a person who says we can survive with no regulation whatsoever. I don't see how we can do that, for example, driving on roads. I don't see how we can do that in terms of, the broad society. You're not allowed to just rob and murder people and go away unscathed. So clearly there's a certain structure that must be maintained.
Yes, but that's a structure rather than regulation per se.
Well, the problem is that we had some good regulation. For example, the Glass-Steagall division between investment banking and the banking arm. That was chipped away at over 30 years and finally removed at the start of this decade.
And I was a stockbroker before Big Bang in the city, and we either acted on behalf of our clients or we were a jobber or a market maker. But you couldn't combine the two functions, so there was no confusion of your interest. There was no conflict of interest. So what you're saying is that where regulation is now failing is because you have got this confliction of interest inherent in every player in the system.
Yes, because they took away the dividing line between northbound and southbound traffic. So that division was there because human behavior is a certain way and always will be. It cannot control itself in excesses when certain basic rules are out of the way. So if you take away the dividing line, everyone drives into each other. It's crazy. The most prudent thing you can do is just put the line back. And we've learned this lesson so many times. And everyone, in the last run-up, it's been this belief that we were somehow smarter this time. This is just classic hubris. We aren't smarter. We're very conflicted if we are allowed to be. So basic things. And the other thing is, the whole big bailing out, too big to fail nonsense. This has got to end because This is capitalism at its very ugliest. This is gutted of its strength.
Yeah, but how can you end that when, you look at things like derivatives, and, I pick on this because everybody understands that derivatives are potentially something rather lethal. You have enormous derivative positions. I've lost count of the hundreds of trillions that
1.4 quadrillion.
Oh my goodness! I can't even imagine that.
That's
the number of dots. Sort of full stops on a page of paper that would take you to the moon and back or something. It's just absolutely staggering. So we've got. We've got these sort of weapons of mass destruction, as someone called CDS. I think it was Warren Buffett called credit default swaps, going way back. If someone in that chain falls over, then you can't stop the whole of the rest of the system falling over. But
it would be a self-clearing mechanism. The real economy is not going to collapse because a bunch of unsustainable constructs follow their normal path to collapse. The derivatives market is the latest manifestation of humans as insane beings. That's crazy. What happened was crazy. And this is where I go back to, I think we're in the mean reversion now, because at 1.4 quadrillion or so of zeros floating around, there is no connection to the real economy there. There's no connection to even the stock and bond markets. The size is insanely multiplied here in this particular dimension. So what I'm saying is that, again, what are you going to do? Add more zeros to try and save this system? What are we going to go round the universe twice?
That's what we're doing.
Yes, that's what we're doing. But it's a unsustainable system that's been sustained for a long time. But here's the thing, because in the adding on for a while, the real economy looked like it was benefiting, right? We had above trend growth. We had 5% global growth at the peak in 2006. We had, a certain amount of people being placated on credit. For example, consumers weren't making gains in wages, largely speaking, but they were able to go buy stuff with nothing down.
And exactly, and not only that, but with the house prices going up, it replaced wage rises in effect. It was an inflation of credit feeding into consumer goods.
It replaced intelligence and personal discipline, really. Nobody needed it because they could get stuff for free. But what I'm saying is now it's different, because now the consumer bubble has burst. The people realize they haven't got any real wage gains now for 30 years. They did lose the house that they should never have had in the first place. So that candy's been taken away. Now you got a very angry mass of people who are, as I've said, toppling governments left and right. So I think that, you know, the people that think they can perpetrate that status quo for a while longer are shocked and amazed at why there's so many angry mobs in the street today. But it's always been thus. You know, you cannot tell them to eat cake for very long before they simply come and say, no, we'll have your cake, thank you. And I think that's what you're getting to today. So, you know, either you're going to have governments fighting with their citizens, or you're going to have them reconciling the two needs. In other words, you cannot just support the financial sector at the expense of everything else. And we're there now. We're there now because the more zeros they try and add, the more stimulus, whatever, the more money printing, the worse it is for the economy. Take Greece as an example, take Spain, Italy, anywhere that they've tried to bail out. Take Ireland. Okay, Ireland actually did everything that they were supposed to do.
Yes, but they had they really did have a problem, didn't they, Danielle? Because they took on their bank's balance sheet liabilities, which amounted to something like 8 or 9 times Ireland's GDP. How can a government survive? It's just a matter of crossing fingers and hoping that economic recovery or whatever will rescue everyone.
Yeah, naivete.
Naivete, as you say, and that's a good word, and a blindness on the other side, because I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems to me that the neoclassical economists, who are very, very quick to promote the benefits of government intervention, keep absolutely quiet about the accumulation of debt, both in the public sector and private sector, that implies. And it's that bit that's really falling over. That was the bubble bit. And we're now in the post-bubble era, as you described, and is watching how that plays out.
Absolutely. Because here's, I offend the left and the right, because I find both policies of extremes to be unhelpful in this. We must cut down governments. They're far too big. We must reinvest in the real economy.
Yeah, well, governments are an inefficient deployment of economic resources.
But we need them unless we are going to live in an anarchy. We need a certain amount of governance and leadership in a civilized society.
A legal structure, if you like,
a legal
within
structure.
Which society
hence
can
the
sort
rule of
itself
law.
out.
The
Yes.
beauty of certain basic concepts like the rule of law.
Contract.
Yes. It requires people, though, to be caught if they're breaking laws. It requires them to be prosecuted if they're breaking laws. The great inflation of all the zeros being added also brought with it this intolerance for anyone questioning one's genius. So the regulators were completely gutted of any meaningful equipment or manpower or even rule set. So we should not be so surprised today that we've had no regulation. Nobody wanted it, no one paid for it, and no one gave them any meaningful powers. So it's the ultimate taunt to now say, well, the regulators were toothless. Yes, and designed to be so by the last several administrations, and certainly in America and other countries. And so here's the thing: it's simply this. Cut the line of credit between the taxpayer and the financial institutions. Let them fall on their own sword. The real economy will come out of it like Pegasus. I am sure of it. It won't come out worse than it is already, because this poop has already hit the fan. We've extended and pretended and supported some of the people who have continued to extract their bonuses and ridiculous pay out of a system that is not worthy of any merit whatsoever. It's been a hollow shell. A Ponzi. It's just been a perfect Ponzi. But now we need to actually say, okay, how are we going to get the real economy back to work? Because it's actually customers that drive business. If you don't have any customers, this is what the finance sector and the champions of industry forgot in their neat little circles of clubs and meetings. If you don't have customers, you don't have any sales. Because now you can't just lever it up. So you got to go back and pick those people up. And it's complicated. It takes time. It takes shifts in policy and behavior on all levels. But it's time to admit that system can't continue.
Right. Okay. Now, I can understand that. Let's turn the focus slightly onto money itself. We have a situation where governments have expanded the quantity of money in circulation very substantially in amounts which is hard to find a historical parallel. There are individual historical parallels, but this has never happened where all the major currencies have undergone a massive monetary inflation at the same time. And it's all part of what you described earlier, this attempt to counteract the contraction of bank credit and to stop bank credit producing the Irving Fisher, style implosion, I suppose is the right word. This expansion of money, just pure money, is bound to have inflationary consequences down the road. With inflationary consequences, if you hold interest rates where they are, then real interest rates go more and more negative. But if they go more and more negative, and you try and control that, it means that you have to raise nominal interest rates. You start raising nominal interest rates, then the first people in the bankruptcy queue are governments. Mm-hmm. And that essentially is the problem that Greece has, mm-hmm. Spain has, and all the rest of it, which you referred to just now. How do we get out of that problem? Is there any escape?
Oh, yes, because we've seen this on a country-by-country scale throughout history as well. They need to knock off zeros. They are actually bankrupt. It's farcical to say they will go bankrupt. They are actually bankrupt. They've only been able to continue like this by pretending that certain things are not the case. So, we've already had that happen. The system simply has to reset itself, which means that governments won't be able to pay each other back. I started talking about, 5 years ago, I was doing a similar interview in Las Vegas, and they said, what could they possibly do? And I said, well, the good news is it's not a pandemic. Okay, that would be a really big threat. It's not a wiping out the world's fresh water supply. That would be really big. That would be hard to fix. This is just zeros. This is the plague of zeros that have stacked up on the hubris of certain beliefs. We simply need to knock off the zeros. So yes, governments have to forgive each other. Everything gets zeroed down, kind of like those crossing out of zeros in mathematical equations. And we get back to the business of what resources are there? What can we actually support in terms of investment, and as I say, you're going to have to invest in certain things in the economy that are life supporting, like water and energy and shelter and
health.
Health, yeah. But it's a period where everyone has to kind of get a wake-up call in the sense of the culture of entitlement, I think, cannot continue in this dynamic. People will have to start taking responsibility for their own health, for example, which means stop eating so much, start exercising more, stop depending on drugs to survive. And the people that can make the adjustments will thrive quite well through this period, I believe. The people that can't, well, then they can't. If you're a banker who only knows how to add zeros and you can't think up anything more productive to do with your time, well, then you won't have a job in this new world. Can you make anything? Can you add value? Do you have any wisdom in you? Can you help us with strength of leadership? Those are the things this world needs. And that's always been the case. And I just think that we have worked ourselves into a fevered pitch, belief that this is truly unprecedented in human history. We'll never, and I agree with you, the scale of it is probably
daunting.
Daunting is a great word for it, daunting. But is it fatal? I think not. I believe that we will finally learn some lessons. We'll reset the systems. We'll get back to some good laws on the books about risk takers being separated away from deposit takers. We'll go back to accountability. And then probably 20 years from now, we'll start taking away those rules again.
There's a cycle of human behavior, isn't
how it works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. How do we find you? You have a website?
Yes. So I write a blog, jugglingdynamite.com. And it was
juggling as in throwing up balls in the air, as it were.
Of dynamite sticks,
Dynamite,
yes. And it was born out of my book of 2007, Juggling Dynamite, An Insider's Wisdom on Money Markets and Wealth That Lasts.
Right.
And so I started writing the blog out of the book, and it has readers all over the world. And I try and be the filter. I try and help people who are trying to, disseminate this huge torrent of information and clips and opinions, and just try and distill it down to, here's the things that are actually real and matter, and here's the trends we're watching. And again, I'm longer term optimistic. I don't think civilization will blow because the zeros just burst, but I think that we will come to admire different leadership going forward than we've worshipped over the last little while.
Danielle, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.